Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to another Orland Park Public Library Zoom webinar. Tonight, we are going to be having our conservative case for climate change, and today we have Andrew Pinelli here, and we're going to be talking about the conservative case of climate change. About 1/3 of all Americans either have some degree of skepticism regarding climate change as an issue. This presentation moves beyond scientific-based arguments for taking action and refocuses on a compelling case for solutions that are both in line with conservative principles and deliver desired outcomes. Throughout the presentation, the audience is engaged in an interactive discussion, providing feedback on what constitutes a conservative solution and whether proposed solutions meet a conservative litmus test. So without further ado, I hand it over to Andrew Pinelli. Andrew, you're still muted.
Thank you, Ariana, and welcome everybody to tonight's presentation, The Conservative Case for Smart Climate Action. I'm Andy Pinelli. I lead a chapter of Citizens Climate Education in the Chicago South suburbs. We're a not-for-profit volunteer organization that educates citizens on climate solutions and advocates for bipartisan climate action. My background is 30 years in the Fortune 500 in product innovation and development, and I'm a huge believer in the power of capitalism and free market enterprise to solve problems. They solve them efficiently and they generate innovative solutions. I'm here with Brad Bradley tonight, who has 32 years in the EPA, and thank you, Ariana, for helping to facilitate the meeting tonight. I'll share screen. So tonight we'll be talking about climate change, and it's become so highly politicized that we're going to attempt to reframe the issue tonight within a context of conservative values. Conservatives seek to preserve that which is good, and they traditionally value attributes like prudence and accountability, transparency, fiscal responsibility, maintaining a strong and ready defense, and ensuring we have future opportunities of prosperity for our children. And while this presentation is primarily intended for a discussion of conservatives by conservatives, it's for left-leaning folks that are in the audience. It's an opportunity to learn more about the concerns of the other side and what discussion points resonate with the conservative sense of what's important. This is not a debate tonight. We're not going to try changing beliefs, but just open up new perspectives. So just a few ground rules. We'll share information to illuminate, not to argue, and we'll listen to each other with respect, and we'll keep our responses crisp to be respectful of time. Just on a note, since we've got Ron Reagan on the screen there, just a reminder that there's a proud conservative heritage of the Republican Party and conservation heritage. Republican administrations helped create the EPA, initiate the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and Ronald Reagan himself signed the Montreal Protocol limiting CFCs, which saved the ozone layer and prevented hundreds of thousands of deaths from skin cancer. So tonight, the way that we'll manage the meeting is we'll have we'll really speak to three questions. Is there a conservative argument for addressing climate change? And what would the proposed conservative legislation look like if we were to adopt it? And we'll propose some legislation and ask if this passes a conservative litmus test. as a solution. I'll open up with some presentation slides on the first two questions, and then we'll open up the mics and have a short discussion. And then I'll present a solution, and we'll have about another 10 minutes of slides, and then we'll open it back up for questions and comments. The chat box is disabled tonight, so if you have questions along the way, type them into the chat box or hold them until we get to the first break, and then we'll answer them at the break. But I'd like to share first off how I became an engaged citizen on this issue. I was privileged to witness a Senate subcommittee hearing on climate change held by John McCain. He had a number of NASA climatologists speaking, and in walked one of our longest serving and most conservative senators, Ted Stevens from Alaska. Ted said, you know, we've had coastal ice forever here in Alaska that's buffered us from harsh winter storms. The winter temperatures have warmed and the sea ice is gone. And now our coastlines are taking a full hammering from those storms. And I have to spend money to move coastal communities. This was kind of my aha moment, because something was different. The climate's changing, and it's going to be very expensive for taxpayers, not just in Alaska, but elsewhere. And what could we do about it? So I also kind of experienced some of my own change. I've been a lifelong scuba diver ever since I was a teenager. And over 50 years, I've had hundreds of dives all over the Western Hemisphere. One half of the coral reefs since I started diving are now dead. And some of these reefs were 1,000 to 2,000 years old. Two of the main culprits, and there's a number of reasons, but two of the major culprits are warmer waters from changing climate. These reefs live in a very narrow temperature range. And of the 40 billion tons of extra CO2 that we pump into the sky every year, half is absorbed into the ocean, which makes it more acidic, and that damages the reefs. So while I hope that there's still coral reefs for my grandchildren to dive when they grow up, this is beyond trying to save my favorite pastime. Experts say the remaining reefs will be gone in 30 years at the current pace of decline, and coral reefs are the ocean's nurseries. 1/4 of ocean species depend on the reefs, and 1 billion people get some part of their daily protein from the oceans. Now, there's other changes going on that are somewhat concerning. We're witnessing a different world kind of before our eyes. I get the argument that the climate is always changing, but according to the NOAA, this is about 100 times faster than anything that we would call normal. Many scientists are saying that we haven't seen this much change this fast since the last ice age 11,000 years ago. Now, why does it matter? Well, the snow and the ice normally would reflect heat back into outer space directly from the albedo effect from all of that white ice and snow. But with it melted, you get sunlight hitting the blue water, and it absorbs the heat and it melts the ice, and it creates a negative feedback loop, which just keeps melting more and more ice, warming more and more temperature. When that ice melts on land, it raises sea levels. And when salinity changes because of freshwater ice melt, it can affect ocean currents, which can also affect weather patterns. So this is a concern, and that's something that we need to be mindful of. Now, I'm going to spend just about 90 seconds. This is some of the arguments that we'll present for taking action tonight really do not depend at all on what the current prevailing climate science is, but just to level set, and not because I necessarily believe it, but because we have to decide whether we're going to acknowledge that there's a risk that the scientists could be right on this. We'll spend 90 seconds talking about the greenhouse effect, which is a good thing. We've got water vapor, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide floating around in the upper atmosphere. It allows the sun's energy to come in, and as the heat from the earth radiates outward, it traps some of it. A very good thing. Without it, the temperature of the earth would be 60 degrees colder. But since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the world has been burning lots and lots of fossil fuels. About 2 trillion tons of CO2 have been added to the atmosphere. And half of that has been put in the last 30 years. So what we're seeing as described by these premier scientific organizations, the NASA, NOAA, the National Academies of Sciences, the American Meteorological Society, and about a dozen more, is that the additional carbon dioxide is caused primarily from human activity and by burning fossil fuels. It's added 48% more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and this is what they are saying. These scientific organizations is what's driving climate change. Now, they will add that the warmer it gets, the more CO2 we put in, the warmer it gets, and that can have a disruptive effect on climate and contribute to climate instability. They're saying specifically, it's not wobble, it's not solar flares, it's not volcanoes, it's not a natural cycle, it's greenhouse gases, and that no other theory explains the data as accurately. And by the way, they say that you can use isotopic fingerprints on the atmospheric carbon samples to determine where that CO2 came from, vegetative matter, or burning fossil fuels, or volcanoes. So we've got more CO2 in the atmosphere than we have at any time in the last 800,000 years. They would show you this chart similar to this, which this is a NASA chart that shows 400,000 years of CO2 levels, which in the 1950s or around there jumped over 300 level for the first time, and then currently we're at 415 parts per million, and corresponding to that, we have temperature increase of, since the turn of the last century, of about 1 degree centigrade. Now, that's, so we have to really ask ourselves, because I'm not defending their position, but what we have to ask ourselves is, when this many prestigious scientific organizations take this position, put their credibility at rest, put it on the website, is it reasonable to assume that there is a risk that they could be right? Now, let's examine some conservative values related to the issue of this issue of climate change and climate instability. So defense readiness ranks high as a conservative issue of importance. The Department of Defense, for most of the last decade, has called extreme weather events a threat multiplier. It leads to droughts, flooding, agricultural disruption, and property destruction, which in turn results in food and water shortages, which creates refugee issues and conflict. And that in turn can destabilize governments, add to global instability, and potentially draw in our military into to conflicts. So this is a quote from Jim Mattis. Climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops operate today. That's a perspective from the military. I also wanted to show you another perspective on this, and I'm going to show you some video just for a second.
It's not possible to wall off all that water. there's just too much.
That water is the economic lifeblood of this region. That's why the port is here. That's why the military is here.
It's our largest naval base in the world, and we're not going anywhere.
Flooding is impacting all the bases in Hampton Roads.
We have to have sailors that are ready to go to fight our nation's battles.
Pretty difficult to get the people onto the base if they're driving down roads that have standing water on them.
Flooding is happening on sunny days. Constant environmental challenges degrade readiness over time.
The commanding officer has to turn off the electrical power to the piers.
It cancels church, it cancels softball games.
And the stresses add up over time, especially in a military life that's stressful enough.
The U.S. military, they see the problem. The naysayers are jeopardizing U.S. national security, and they are jeopardizing the U.S. economy.
Facts are that the water's coming up and the land's going down.
Water is the water, and it doesn't matter what your politics are, it still comes in my yard and my basement.
Okay, that was Rear Admiral Kevin Slates, Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, Captain Dean Vanderlei from the Norfolk Naval Station, and talking about some of the issues that they're dealing with rising sea level. So one more example of military readiness issues. This is Air Force Base in Nebraska, and a year and a half, well, 2 years ago, that it was underwater because of a premature winter snow melt and early spring rains. This is another instance where military readiness was compromised. The Department of Defense in 2019 put out a report that said 74 of 79 military installations were threatened potentially by climate change over the next 20 years. So if we move away from military to kind of what's going on in the business world and investments, investment and insurance firms are acknowledging the risks as well. BlackRock, which manages an unbelievably large $7.8 trillion in financial assets, they are now requiring that businesses that they invest in submit sustainability plans to them that address how companies plan to manage operational risks related to climate change, and how they're expected to detail how their businesses are going to be prepared to manage and contribute to net zero economic environment operating in 2050. So the business world is starting to, and insurance worlds are starting to recognize that climate risk is investment risk. And that's getting the attention of Republican senators that recognize that, are starting to recognize the risk. This is Senator Mike Braun, a Republican from Indiana, who helped initiate with a Democratic partner, the Climate Solutions Caucus in the Senate. There's now 8 members in the Senate. And he says this is not about politics. This is physics and chemistry. And the longer we wait to address it, the longer it's going to take to fix. Now, during the Trump administration, the 4th National Climate Assessment was released, and it had some concerning information in it. It was 18 different government departments that pooled their best research together on climate assessment. And what they said was that in the Midwest, you know, we tend to think of this as an East Coast, West Coast, South Coast issue, but they highlighted that the Midwest impact could be very serious, expecting between 5 and 25% crop yield loss. And we have a $13 billion ag industry here in Illinois, but corn and soybean loss because of wetter springs and hotter, drier summers. But overall, they stressed that there could be as much as an 8 or 10% GDP loss as a result of climate impact on US GDP. Now, I want to stop talking about risk and start talking about opportunity. You know, a transition to clean energy economy, and by that I mean energy that either emits low carbon or no carbon, like solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, nuclear power. That transition to clean energy could result in cleaner air, cleaner water, and that is a health improvement opportunity. We have 40 million US citizens that struggle with air currently. They have asthma, COPD, lung cancer. Some of them have heart conditions, and the smog sends them to the hospital, and the hotter it gets, the worse the smog is. And there's over 100,000 premature deaths each year related to air quality, and that results in tens of billions of dollars in related economic cost. You know, if people are sick and they check into the emergency room, the taxpayers are picking up the tab on that. But there's other opportunities, not only to reduce the costs and to improve health, but there's business opportunities here. There's an opportunity for the US to profit by leading the world in renewable energy technology. You know, we got to think like Wayne Gretzky. We got to skate to where the puck is going if we want to win. The Chinese are outspending us on clean energy by 3 to 1, and they are issuing 50% more patents on renewable energy than we are at the moment. So there's an opportunity to lead here and profit by leading. There's another opportunity to reduce property damage. We have a very disturbing trend going on here. This is natural disaster expenditures from 1980 to 2020, a 40-year period. On this axis, we've got the number of billion-dollar events each year, inflation adjusted. And on this axis, we have the total dollar volume of the events. Now, as you can see, from 1980 to 2020, we have quadrupled the number of billion-dollar events. We're talking here droughts, wildfires, flooding, rain events and hurricane events, intensity that cause storm damage. All of these events now have quadrupled, not only in number, but in the total dollar volume, 400% increase. So there's now in 2017 alone, we had a $450 billion in damage. Was some of that attributable? Attribution science is getting better in terms of how much of that 4-foot rainstorm in Houston is a result of our warming climate. You know, we can attribute some of it. It's hard to, attribution science is getting better, but it's hard to attribute exact dollar volumes to it. But there's a huge opportunity here to try to put a stop to this disturbing trend. And there's about a dozen climate models worldwide that are in use, but they all say the same basic thing, that by 2021, we will have moved from, we will have grown in temperature increase between 3 and 4 maybe 3 and 4.5 degrees centigrade here. So if we go to 3.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase, this is not a future compatible with prosperity. This is more floods, more fire, wildfires, and sea level rise, agricultural disruption. So why take action? So yes, there's ways to act which are really not in line with conservative values. And some of them have been discussed, and you know, these would be programs that caused economic harm, that impeded growth, that cost job growth, and that really raised the national debt. We don't want to do anything like that. But I'm going to share with you that there are actions that we can take that have a negligible impact on economics. They don't impede job growth. They don't harm the consumer. They don't harm the poor and the middle class. And we're going to be focused on those types of actions, actions which I'll argue that are in line with conservative values. Now, if they have a negligible economic impact, but the risk of not acting is all the things we just talked about: military readiness issues, stronger storms, more flooding, increased wildfires, and the costs related to that, the costs related to healthcare, and agricultural disruption. When the downside risks of not acting are catastrophic and the downside risk of acting is negligible, prudence dictates that we take action. And with that, what I'll do is stop sharing. I'd like to open this up for discussion and take a look at everybody that's out there. And Ariana, ask you to unmute everybody and have some discussion about what we've just seen, and ask questions about what people think about the downside risks of climate instability that have been highlighted, and what their reaction is to the opportunities that have been presented. Can we get everybody on a gallery view, Ariana?
Yes. There we go.
And Ariana, we might start with any questions that were raised during the, if any questions came through.
How to do this? Oh, someone raised their hand. We have Albert Wagner.
Oh, Al Wagner.
Andy, can you hear me?
Sure. How are you, Al?
Can you hear me, Andy?
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. Thank
Okay,
you.
so many people say that the cost of climate change is huge to, prevent it. But you seem to think that the cost can be largely averted. So what would be the basis of thinking that the cost of climate change isn't gigantic?
Well, there are certainly a lot of costs associated with climate change. I don't want to oversimplify it, but we don't have to spend trillions and trillions of dollars to try to solve the problem. What we need is the market to have the right pricing signals to spur innovation and let the free market profit by the opportunities that'll come forth from that. So certainly there's a lot of change that has to happen to get to a net zero economy by 2050. But the way that we can start it is by having the right legislation that doesn't add a lot of cost to our national debt, and that it's self-financing and that spurs the market to innovation by evening the playing field for renewable energy versus fossil fuels. And we'll be talking about that more later, but this is not going to be easy. This is going to be the biggest challenge that we've ever faced, largely because it changes most aspects of how we conduct our daily life. But it's progress, as progress is made, there's profits to be made by it, and we'll talk more about the legislation that I'm proposing that can do that. But what I'm suggesting is there will not be costs to the gross domestic product of the United States. There will not be job loss as a result of it, and there will not be significant growth in national debt as a result of it if we do it right. That's really what I'm speaking to.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for that question, though. Any other comments about, we talked about a number of things. We talked about military readiness. How does that resonate with folks that are on the call? Do they recognize this climate instability as a threat multiplier, and or do you recognize some of the opportunities that we've talked about as being real opportunities that we can take advantage of?
We have a question in the Q&A. I'm not sure if you're able to see it because one of them is a link to a article. Are you able to see the Q&A?
Yeah, I do see it. And I can't say that I'm familiar with that. Does Doctor want to kind of give us a quick summary of what he's seen in the article?
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so this is an article I had read a long time ago, so I have to kind of remember what's in it, but it shows various charts and graphs of metrics over time, and some of the things that are like you'd mentioned the solar flare, and it actually has a diagram of the trends of the sunspot activities over time, and then it superimposes that upon the variations in the Arctic temperature measurements, and the correlation is visually stunning. When you look at it, it's almost, and it's not a slope that it happens to be the same slope that increased over the time. It's a fluctuation that goes up and down at variable rates, and it just matches so perfectly. It just seems a hard argument to dismiss and say, no, there's no correlation between that.
Yeah, and I think that I think from my knowledge of it, it's not that solar flares don't have an impact on certainly what we experience temperature wise. I think it's more along which data sets are better explained by the theory, and I'm taken aback by the number of organizations, scientific organizations that I recognize that have looked at the data, staked their credibility on it. And what I would suggest is that you go to a site called Skeptical Science. It's either .org or .com. This is an organization that has been kind of set up to try to cast light on different scientific theories. That's been my go-to source for the trying to get a handle on the different types of information that we hear out there. Whether, because I know that there are folks that believe this is a natural cycle. It's not related to solar flare. And I know folks that also believe that it's because of earth wobble. So I think the broader question is, if you don't know for sure, is there an argument that says you should take action if the action doesn't, if you can take action without harming the economy or without affecting job growth, those sorts of things, should you take action even if you're not sure? Is it prudent to take action if you can take action without, without significant downside risk of taking action? So I appreciate, and I will look at that source. I hope you'll look at Skeptical Science and see what they're saying about solar flares, and then let's compare notes afterwards. But the broader question is, because I'm not here to defend NASA or the NOAA or the National Academies of Sciences. I'm really arguing that if you can't be sure, and if there's a significant risk of it, we're compelled to take action. But thank you for bringing that up. But that I would like other folks to comment on. Do you buy in to the argument that if risk of acting is low enough, and if the harm of not acting could be high enough, that we should act? What are your thoughts about that? Anybody have an opinion they'd like to share on that before we move to the next question? Okay, let's move to the next question.
Hey, Andy?
Yeah.
It's Brad. I just want to add one thing. You mentioned many impacts from climate change. There's certainly one of them that's going to happen regardless of solar flare activity, and that's the acidification of the ocean. Carbon dioxide simply turns into carbonic acid when it hits the water. So that's going to happen no matter what. I just wanted to add that.
That's a great point. Thanks, Brad. And that's one I should have thought of, because that speaks to my favorite pastime in an ecosystem that is very important to a large segment of the earth in terms of the population and our ability to feed ourselves. Now, my next question really had to do with, okay, so let's assume that for a moment we want to take some action, but we want it to conform to our conservative values. So what would legislation look like that would correspond to things that conservatives think are important? Let me just ask you, if we decided we were going to manage, we were trying to manage the downside risk of climate change because it could happen, what would we want to construct that legislation to look like? And let me just throw a few prompts out there. Would we want it to grow the size of government significantly? Any thoughts on that? I don't think we'd want a big government solution to this. Would we want a lot of onerous regulations related to this, to our legislation, if we were going to construct some legislation to address it? Would we want it to impinge on our consumer freedom of choice? We want people telling us to eat, telling us what to drive, telling us what we can and can't do. I don't think we'd want to do that. Would we want government picking technology winners like Obama did with Solyndra? It's a half $500 million bet that didn't come to fruition? Would we want it to economically negatively impact the poor and the middle class if we took action, or would we want to really make the national debt a lot bigger to try to finance our solutions? And would any other thoughts about what we would want our legislation to look like? Do you agree in principle of what I'm considering conservative solutions or conservative attributes to such legislation that we might pick? Any thoughts on that?
Another question in the Q&A. They're asking, can you explain further your low impact solution proposal?
Okay, I can. And let me go back into the presentation. If any questions come up, just hold them for a couple of minutes. I'm going to show you a few more slides, and I'm going to share with you what the legislative proposal is that I have that I'm advocating for, or suggesting we consider advocating for. So let me share screen. Okay, just hang with me a second. So the free market solution is really, I think the free market can really help us sort out which solutions will best address climate change. There's a fantastic track record of efficiently solving problems and driving solutions. But the free market can only fix problems that they can see. And the problem is that with fossil fuels today, the pricing, the true cost is not reflected in the price of those products. They're obscured by subsidies. We have tens of billions of dollars of subsidies that are going to the fossil fuel companies each year, and have been for a long time. Now, transparency is a core conservative value, but pricing and costs of fossil fuels are not transparent. The price we pay at the meter or the pump does not reflect the true cost of fossil fuel products. So one of the issues is that fossil fuel companies are never charged for the damage that can be attributed to them from burning their products. I'm talking about maybe the more intense rainstorms, or the more intense hurricane, or the fires, floods or storms that might be a result of a warming planet, but also the health consequences that we talked about earlier, which, from diesel fuels, particulate matter, and the health consequences of those things. So none of that's reflected in the price of those products. And the solution is to price fossil fuels to reflect their true cost. And that will trigger and unleash innovation in the power of capitalism. It's really a fluke of the market that we allow anyone who wants to pollute the air with any amount of carbon emissions that they want to for free. It's not very conservative. There's no accountability. So if we fix that fluke, we can unleash the innovation and power of capitalism to solve the problem. I want to show you an unprecedented survey of US economists of all political stripes that signed a statement supporting putting a price on carbon emissions. And they said that the most effective way to deal with climate change is to put an annually increasing price on carbon emissions. And return, or you got to return those funds back to every American household, though. That's the catch. So the signatures included the chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors to 4 Republican presidents. Now, this is not something that I'm sure you've caught up to yet, and I wanted to share this with you as well, because things are moving pretty fast. That the major fossil fuel company CEOs were at a meeting the summer before last in Rome, and they signed an agreement stating that they recognize that a significant acceleration of the transition to a low carbon future is necessary. And it's necessary to keep global warming below 2°C. This is mind blowing, because this is the first time I'm aware of that major oil executives acknowledge the need to keep temperatures from rising above 2 degrees C, that they acknowledge burning fossil fuels contributes to the problem, and that they're saying that they would support carbon pricing if governments initiated them. So this was a very, very significant moment there. And you've already started to see some of these petroleum companies and fossil fuel companies start to change their business models as a result of it. And also the US Chamber of Commerce, no bastion of liberalism here, for the first time this month, acknowledged the need to accelerate US emission reductions. Now, we've also starting to see some Republicans start to support and consider carbon pricing. Putting a price on carbon, Lindsey Graham said, was the way to go in my view. And I want to share with you, with no further ado, what I'm suggesting is a conservative solution to the issue. It's not the entire solution to it, but it takes us a long way there. And it's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's a market-driven solution. It basically, what it does is it puts a fee on oil, gas, and coal from fossil fuel companies at the point of extraction, where they mine it, where they drill for it, or where they import it. And it starts out small at $15 a ton per year. That fee on carbon emissions would increase annually about $10 per ton. So it goes up a little bit each year. But this would be equivalent to about 15 cents per gallon on a gallon of gas, and going up 10 cents a gallon. It would have a similar impact on the pricing of natural gas and your electricity if it was coming from a coal or a natural gas fired plant. It's collected by the Department of Treasury, and it goes to, it would go to it would go to every US household in a equivalent, in equal shares in the form of a monthly dividend check. Now, what does this do? This starts to price fossil fuels to more reflect their true cost. It sends a very strong signal to the market, pricing signal that will trigger a torrent of investment in clean energy. It levels the field for clean energy to compete, and consumers will be able to switch to cheaper clean energy, pocket the savings. Greenhouse gases will be reduced to manageable levels. So once again, it's the oil, the emissions fee goes on coal, oil, and natural gas. It's paid for by the fossil fuel companies, collected by Treasury, and issued checks to American households. So the checks would add up on an annual basis to about $790 for a family of 4. That would cover any pricing increase that were passed on by fossil fuel companies, and also on applying, increases in energy intensive products that where prices might go up. By year 5, those monthly dividend checks would add up to over $3,000, and by year 10, over $4,000. So we've got some studies that show that most middle-class families will financially benefit from that. It's not meant to be an income shifting scheme for poor and middle class, but most of them will end up financially benefiting from the program. They will especially benefit if they make the switch to energy saving appliances and energy and clean energy, cheaper clean energy products. We'll see a 40% reduction in carbon emissions over the next dozen years. It's effective. We've got some studies that show that I can share with you. And we have a couple of different studies. One says it'll grow jobs. The other is not quite so bullish on job growth, but doesn't hurt jobs, but doesn't necessarily grow them. But we do start to put a dent in that $240 billion of average annual costs of environmental and health. And we do that without harming the economy. Border adjustments ensure that we remain competitive internationally. And we start to put a dent in that 100,000 lives lost every year from the health impacts of burning fossil fuels. This does not grow government in any significant way. It's self-funding, so it's revenue neutral. And the program also is designed, the legislation, so that it's self-extinguishing. When it's not needed anymore, it just stops becoming legislation. These are the two studies I was referring to. There's a REMI study, which says that this actually has a positive impact on growth. Those checks to households actually act as a stimulus program. And it also not only grows jobs because of that in the energy sector, clean energy jobs, it also grows them in a host of other economic sectors. Also, we've got the Columbia Rhodium study, which is not so bullish on job growth, but talks about the negligible impact on national debt, the negligible impact on GDP, and it also speaks to other aspects of it, like the study does focus on the impact on the poor and the middle class and validates what I just mentioned to you. So we got to remember that of all the costs that we're talking about, there are costs to doing nothing. And this type of legislation can get the ball rolling on helping to ameliorate some of those costs that we've already talked about. So in this type of legislation, investment decisions are made by investors, technology decisions are made by technologists. We've got solutions that are generated by the free market. Consumers are free to spend the dividend checks any way they want. They've got freedom of choice over whatever energy source they want, and it's revenue neutral. So I like what legendary Republican pollster, how it was Frank Luntz described this. He said, if we do this, we get cleaner air, cleaner water, healthier citizens, enhanced national security, great new careers, more innovation into our economy. And that's if the scientists are wrong. If the scientists are right, we get all of that, And we've taken a big step in trying to address what could be one of the biggest challenges that humanity has faced. That's a pretty good bet to make. That's a no regrets strategy. The Doctrine of Prudence, which here it's stated by the Catholics, but also Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, even in situations where you have less than full certainty where the consequences of not acting are serious, it justifies, indeed obligates us to take action to avert potential dangers. I think that's the Doctrine of Prudence that I call it, and I think that that's a conservative principle. From a risk management standpoint, Jim Mattis's quote, "If there's a chance climate change can be as potentially catastrophic as some think, wouldn't it be good to have an insurance policy?" And then my mentor on this subject, we'll hear what he has to say.
And finally, could I say, one of my heroes is Tony Blair on this issue, and he put it best. Suppose we are wrong and there's no such thing as climate change, and we adapt green technologies. All we've done is given our children a cleaner world. Suppose we are right about climate change and do nothing. Then what have we done for our kids?
So John McCain, this is, it's about risk management. And then we can say that we've done all that we could in the brief time that was given to us here on Earth. Now, for us Republicans out there, what I'd like to mention is that climate change is important to younger Republicans, especially the 18 to 40 crowd who recognize that climate change is an issue and wish that the GOP was doing more to take action on carbon emissions. I've thrown a lot at you here. I'm gonna stop share. I've just got a couple of more slides that'll take a minute to wrap up. I want to put some information in the chat box for you here, but I'd like to continue the discussion in terms of what your thoughts are and some of the arguments that have been made, whether they're valid, whether they're conservative. Have we passed a conservative litmus test on this legislation? What additional questions do you have about this legislation?
We have 3 questions in the Q&A. One of them is quite long. The first one we have is, they were saying that there is an excellent assessment of the challenges, opportunities, and costs associated with getting to zero emissions by 2050. And the book is by Bill Gates, and it's called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster.
Okay, great. I have heard about that book. I've seen him in a couple of interviews, and I'm familiar with some of the things that he said. Yeah, he talks about hydrogen as a solution, and but he talks about the challenges that are presented by trying to engineer this transition. But what motivated Gates, I think, to write the book is, he spent a lot of time and money trying to eradicate disease, do better agricultural techniques in Africa. And his light bulb moment in terms of getting into this is that the climate change that he was experiencing while in the field was undermining the work that he was doing to try to reduce poverty and improve the technology that was available to those folks. So I appreciate that comment. What other questions did you have?
Another question is asking if you read Senator James Inhofe book, The Greatest Hoax.
Yeah, I have not read it. I'm familiar with certain elements of it. James Inhofe is one of the great, one of the great climate deniers, and I'm not passing judgment on him for that. He has his reasons to believe that. but I'm not in agreement with some of the things that he has said, but I understand that there's I respect the fact that he disagrees with a lot of the information that we've shared tonight.
Oh, we just found out. Another one. Someone is raising their hand. Albert Wagner. I
Yeah.
believe you. Yeah. You could unmute yourself.
Hey, Al, are you there? I think you're muted.
Here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yeah. So this EICDA will cause a lot of companies that depend on fossil fuels to change how they operate, to become less fuel intensive in order to attract the investment from the population that gets these dividends. So that kind of change can cause a lot of disruption. That is, some businesses will go out of business and other businesses will start and grow. That can happen in different places, and there's just could be a lot of disruption, especially to achieve something as large as a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
So has there been any studies or any idea or any way of measuring how disruptive a carbon tax like the EICDA could be?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with work that's been done in that area. It needs to be done. I think one of the benefits of EICDA, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, is that because it is slow and progressive from a standpoint of the fees, the fee structure, it immediately starts the process of people getting serious about it. If we can get bipartisan support on this, and by the way, I just put in the chat box information where you can find out more information about this legislation, some of the studies that have been done on it, and my contact information. One of the things that, one of the benefits is once you set that pricing signal, if we get bipartisan support for this legislation, so that it starts and it stays in place, it sends such a strong pricing signal that the innovation process will start immediately, and people will start the process to change. There have been some studies on the amount of capital that might be abandoned as a result of this, because there's trillions of dollars of capital in the field that'll eventually be abandoned. But if you start the process now and give yourself 30 years, a lot of the capital that's put in the field or that's in the field now will have reached its useful age by that time, and it'll also incentivize people to not keep putting capital in the field that's going to be abandoned. So the studies in terms of trying to determine the cost of abandoned capital are a little bit loosey-goosey from what I've seen so far, but I think we're going to start seeing more and more serious studies about the business impact of that. But the beauty of this legislation is if it goes into place this year or next year, it starts the ball rolling on keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Does that answer your question now?
Yes, fine.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Other questions? Okay, we've got Ellen out there who's an excellent assessment of the challenges, opportunities.
Yeah, we just answered that one. Sorry, I forgot to move it to the answer one. We answered this one too. We have 2, 3, 4 questions.
So we had a question about how can you spend a little time explaining why the carbon pricing program wouldn't lead to job loss in other countries? Well, there's 40 countries today that have some sort of carbon pricing program in place, and including China has a small one, but Canada has had several of them. One in British Columbia, and then they've just issued another one in Ontario. And that carbon pricing is pretty steep. Great Britain put a price on carbon emissions. It reduced their coal consumption from 40% to 20% in 6 years. There is not reports of related job loss related to that I'm aware of. So there's not a correlation between implementing a carbon pricing program and job loss that I've seen so far. But one of the benefits of this legislation is that it would encourage other countries to put a carbon pricing program into play, because it has a border adjustment where if a country is importing energy or energy intensive products, and they're exporting to the United States, if they don't have a carbon price that's as strong as ours, there will be a tariff put on the products coming into the country. And that's an incentive for them to have the same carbon pricing program as we have, because they're not going to want to leave that money at the border, and and our market is so desirable. Let's see. We have another anonymous. The US can't reduce global emissions to net zero. Wouldn't it make sense to spend our money on mitigation where we see problems? Well, you're right there. We're going to have to spend some money on mitigation, and I'm not arguing that we have to be net zero at a particular point in time. Others are arguing that. The challenge to get to net zero would be huge. I'm not, but is it impossible? I don't know if it's impossible or not, but it is going to be very difficult, especially given future climate predictions. So yes, we do need to certainly pay attention to mitigation. Let me tell you about another one of these hidden costs related to this question. We've got a flood insurance program in this country that's kind of crazy. You know, right here in Illinois, along some of the rivers, you know, people buy flood insurance, their home floods 3 times. The flood insurance is used to rebuild those homes 3 times. And if it floods 3 times, then the government tears it down at its own expense, and taxpayers are paying that. That program is $38 billion in the hole. And today we've got people building in places that they shouldn't be building, buying flood insurance that the taxpayer is going to pick up. That's one of the things that we ought to mitigate right away. But the first step is to acknowledge that climate change may be really happening, because until we acknowledge that and that it may get worse, we're not going to address the problem. I hope I've answered that question. Yeah. And I know that it's sometimes we get varying information on this aspect of it or that aspect. So let's see. Okay. So where is this legislation currently? Okay, so last year, let me go into a couple of slides here and show you where the legislation is at. Let me just shut the chat box down, and I got just a couple more slides, and we'll wrap up. And thank you for those great questions. Those are really thoughtful questions. So I've put in the chat box what you can do. Let me come back to that in a second. Here's the status of the legislation. At the end of the last Congress here a month ago, we had 85 co-sponsors to this bill. It was bipartisan. We didn't have many Republicans. We were trying to get more Republicans, but we did have 100 of the of municipal resolutions. We had the mayor's conference support this legislation. Over 900 organizations, including Trout Unlimited and Republican EN, supporting this legislation. But some of these folks lost their seats in the last election, and we have to. We're kind of reintroducing the bill, but from a very strong base, and we're trying to get a sister bill also introduced into the Senate. Now, when I talk to conservatives on this, I try to argue that, I ask them, I present the legislation to them and they say, well, my constituents aren't asking for this. So the best thing that we can do is call and write our congressman, preferably call them and tell them to support this legislation, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, or legislation like it, and that, climate change is an issue that you want them to address, and address it in a way that doesn't harm the economy, hurt jobs, or build the national debt. You can join advocacy groups like Citizens Climate Lobby, nonpartisan, not-for-profits that are trying to lobby Congress on it. But do call or write. These are in the chat box along with some of that survey information. And I really, in closing, this is a risk management argument that I've presented to you tonight. It's a, we need a trigger for innovation. Republicans always tell me we can solve this with innovation, but they haven't provided the trigger for it. Companies are, in my experience in the Fortune 500, companies are not going to, out of the goodness of their heart, innovate unless they have a reason to. They have to have that pricing signal. That's the trigger for innovation, a price on carbon. And if we conservatives don't like big government, the best thing that we can do to get big government is to ignore this issue. Because if we wait long enough, there'll only be big government solutions that can resolve the problem. And the Republican Party is in need of addressing the concerns of younger Republicans. And, if you're suspicious that some progressives are taking advantage of this opportunity to put, to use climate change as a vehicle to put a whole bunch of other social issues in it, they are. So we need to act with, we need to address climate change as conservatives and as a Republican Party, so that, we have a solution, and one that's not going to grow a lot of big government, and that doesn't include a lot of things in the package that have nothing to do with climate change. So finally, we don't want to be on the wrong side of this bet. This is a risk management discussion. Thank you all for being a part of this presentation. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Ariana. You have my contact information in the chat box. I think I put that in there. Let's see if I did. I didn't. I'll put it in there right now for anybody that's interested. And we'll just leave the line open just for a second, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions if they come up. Okay, thank you very much for being on the call, and thank you for your great questions.
I am going to, so we don't lose any of this once the chat is over, I am going to copy it. And if anybody needs this information, feel free to email the outreach department and make the attention to Ariana. And I will send you all of this information to your email. If you want it, I can send it over to you. I have it copied and ready to go. And want to give a quick thank you again to Andrew. Thank you so much for doing this. I believe the Orland Park, sorry, it's the way Orland Park residents are very grateful for this. Climate change is very important. And I hope everybody was able to get something out of this, get your questions answered. And thank you guys for participating and getting off mute and interacting with us and leaving your great questions. And this is a bit of a series. We have 2 other programs coming up. I believe our next one is in March, correct?
Yes, we got one in March where we'll be playing with a climate simulator and seeing what the results of that from different actions that might be taken to address climate change and what the relative effectiveness of those are expected to be. And then in April, God willing, that we have a movie scheduled if we're getting back together that early. So that's those are some of the events we've got coming up. And I hope that this provided maybe a different type of a look at the issue of climate change than we normally get to hear. And it just is food for maybe a different line of thinking on it than is typical. Thanks again, everybody, for being a part of this presentation.
Thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a good night. And hopefully I see some of you guys again in March. Hi, everybody.
Thank you.